From ancient scrolls to modern classics, welcome to Whispers of Japanese Tales.
The Nose by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. The monk Zenki Naigu was widely known around Ike-no-O for his remarkable nose. It measured about 5 to 6 sun, approximately 15 to 18 centimeters, in length, extending from above his upper lip to below his chin. Its shape was uniformly thick from base to tip, resembling a long, slender sausage that dangled conspicuously from the center of his face. Although Zenki Naigu was now over 50 years old, he had been deeply self-conscious about his nose since his days as a novice monk. Even as he rose to the esteemed position of Nai-Dojo Gubu, an attendant of the inner sanctum, his inner turmoil over his nose never abated. On the surface, however, he maintained a composed demeanor, acting as though it hardly bothered him. This pretense was not merely due to his belief that it was unbecoming for a monk, who ought to devote himself to contemplating the pure land of the afterlife, to fret over such trivial matters. Rather, he despised the idea of others discovering just how much his nose troubled him. Zenki Naigu dreaded conversations in which the word nose might arise more than anything else. Zenki Naigu had two main reasons for being troubled by his nose. The first was practical. The sheer length of his nose made daily life inconvenient. For instance, he couldn't eat meals alone. If he tried, the tip of his nose would inevitably touch the rice in the bowl. To address this, he had one of his disciples sit across from him at mealtimes, holding a wooden board about 1 sun wide and 2 shaku long, roughly 3 centimeters by 60 centimeters, to prop up his nose while he ate. However, this arrangement was anything but simple. It was an awkward task for both the disciple holding the board and for Naigu, whose dignity was perpetually tested. Once, when a junior monk took over the duty, he happened to sneeze, causing his hand to tremble and the nose to fall into a bowl of porridge. This incident became so infamous that it was widely gossiped about, even reaching as far as Kyoto. Yet, this kind of inconvenience was not the primary source of Naigu's distress. What truly tormented him was the blow his nose dealt to his pride. His sense of self-respect suffered far more deeply than any practical embarrassment ever could. The townspeople of Ike-no-O regarded Zenki Naigu as fortunate for being a monk, considering his peculiar nose. They reasoned that, with such a nose, no woman would ever agree to be his wife. Some even speculated that it was precisely because of his nose that he had chosen the monastic life. However, Naigu himself never believed that being a monk had spared him from the burden of his nose. His sense of pride was far too delicate to be affected by external circumstances, such as whether or not he could take a wife. For Naigu, the issue of his nose transcended practical concerns. It was a deeply personal affront to his dignity. Determined to address the wound to his self-esteem, Naigu made both active and passive efforts to restore his sense of self-worth. Whether by direct actions or subtle avoidance, he sought to mend the damage that his nose had inflicted on his pride. The first solution Zenki Naigu contemplated was finding a way to make his long nose appear shorter than it actually was. He devoted himself to this endeavor with great enthusiasm, experimenting in front of a mirror when no one else was around. Adjusting his face from various angles, he searched tirelessly for the most flattering perspective. Sometimes, changing the angle of his face alone didn't satisfy him. In such moments, he would rest his chin on his hand or press his fingers against the tip of his nose, carefully studying his reflection with unwavering determination. Despite his efforts, however, he never succeeded in achieving a look that made him feel his nose appeared satisfactorily short. In fact, there were times when the harder he tried, the more exaggerated the length of his nose seemed to him. Whenever his attempts ended in frustration, Naigu would sigh heavily as he returned the mirror to its box. Resigned and disheartened, he would reluctantly go back to his study desk, where he resumed chanting the Canon Sutra, though his heart remained burdened by the futile quest. Zenki Naigu also became increasingly preoccupied with observing the noses of others. The temple in Ike-no-O was a bustling place, often hosting assemblies and lectures for monks and lay people alike. Its grounds were densely packed with monk quarters, and the bathhouse was kept steaming daily by temple residents. As a result, a steady stream of people, both clergy and layfolk, frequented the temple. Naigu took it upon himself to scrutinize the faces of these visitors with unrelenting focus. He hoped to find at least one person with a nose like his own, believing that such a discovery would bring him some relief. To his eyes, nothing else about their appearance mattered, not the deep blue suican robes or the white katabira garments. Even the more familiar sights of saffron-colored hoods and dull gray monk robes seemed to blend into the background. He didn't see people. He saw only noses. Yet, no matter how diligently he searched, he never found another nose quite like his. While he occasionally spotted hooked or crooked noses, none came close to matching the distinctive length and thickness of his own. The more his search proved fruitless, the deeper his dissatisfaction grew. On more than one occasion, Naigu, distracted by his frustration, would pinch the tip of his dangling nose while speaking to someone, only to catch himself in the act. Embarrassed by this absent-minded gesture, he would blush, his discomfort betraying the emotional toll of his obsessive comparison. Finally, Zenki Naigu even turned to the sacred texts of Buddhism and secular literature, hoping to find a historical or legendary figure with a nose like his own. Perhaps discovering such a precedent could provide him with some solace. However, no scripture mentioned that Mokuren or Shariputra had particularly long noses. Likewise, eminent figures such as Nagarjuna and Ushvaghosha were depicted as bodhisattvas with ordinary, human noses. This absence of representation only deepened Naigu's isolation. Once, in the course of hearing tales from China, he learned about Liu Bei of the Shu Han kingdom, who was said to have extraordinarily long ears. Naigu couldn't help but imagine how comforting it would have been if, instead of long ears, Liu Bei had been renowned for an exceptionally long nose. Such a notion might have made Naigu feel a little less alone in his plight. While Zenki Naigu devoted himself to the passive and contemplative efforts of reconciling his feelings about his nose, he also actively pursued methods to shorten it. These attempts were so numerous and varied that they scarcely need enumeration here. Naigu tried everything he could think of. He brewed and drank concoctions made from crow gourd, karasuuri, hoping they might have a shrinking effect. He even went so far as to smear mouse urine on his nose, convinced by some obscure remedy. Yet, no matter what he tried, his nose stubbornly remained the same, a dangling 5 or 6 sun of length hanging prominently over his upper lip. All his efforts came to nothing, leaving the same burdensome nose as a constant presence in his life. One autumn, a monk who was both Zenki Naigu's disciple and attendant traveled to the capital on an errand for Naigu. While there, he encountered a physician, an acquaintance of his, who claimed to know a method for shortening long noses. This physician, originally from China, was then serving as an attendant monk at Korakuji Temple. When the disciple returned and relayed this information, Naigu outwardly maintained his usual demeanor, pretending to be indifferent to his nose. He avoided any immediate eagerness to try the method and instead spoke in a casual tone. During meals, for instance, he remarked how burdensome it must be for his disciple to assist him with his nose every time. Though outwardly composed, Naigu secretly hoped the monk would persuade him to give the method a try. The disciple, of course, saw through Naigu's pretense. Yet, rather than feeling resentment toward his master's subtle manipulation, he was moved by sympathy for the inner struggle that prompted such behavior. Perhaps it was this sense of compassion that led him to fulfill Naigu's unspoken wish. Just as Naigu had anticipated, the disciple enthusiastically encouraged him to try the physician's remedy. As expected, Naigu eventually yielded to the disciple's earnest persuasion and agreed to test the method. The method for shortening the nose was surprisingly simple. Boil the nose in hot water and then have someone step on it. At the temple, hot water was readily available from the bathhouse, which was heated daily. Following the instructions, the disciple fetched a pail filled with scalding hot water so hot that it was nearly impossible to touch. However, directly submerging the nose into the pail posed a risk of burning Naigu's face from the rising steam. To address this, they modified the setup by creating a lid for the pail from a wooden tray, oshiki, cutting a hole in its center. This allowed only the nose to be immersed in the boiling water while shielding the rest of Naigu's face from harm. When the nose was submerged, Naigu was surprised to find that, despite the intense heat of the water, the sensation in his nose remained entirely unaffected. It did not feel hot in the slightest, as though the nerve endings had no sensitivity to the heat. Thus, the first step of the procedure proceeded without incident. After some time, the disciple monk spoke. "Surely, it must be boiled enough by now." Zenki Naigu gave a faint smile. He thought to himself that, from those words alone, no one would guess they were talking about his nose. Meanwhile, his nose, steeped in the scalding water, began to feel an itchy, tingling sensation, almost as though it had been bitten by fleas. When Naigu withdrew his nose from the hole in the lid, steam still rising from it, the disciple immediately began the next step. Placing the steaming nose on the wooden floorboards, he carefully but firmly pressed down on it with his feet. Naigu, lying down to stretch his nose flat on the floor, watched as the disciple's feet moved up and down, methodically stepping on his nose. The scene was almost surreal. His nose extended before him, and the rhythmic motion of the monk's feet played out like a peculiar dance in his line of vision. The disciple monk occasionally cast a pitying glance at Zenki Naigu's bald head as he carried out his task. With a hesitant tone, he murmured, "Does it hurt?" The doctor said to step firmly, "But, are you sure it doesn't hurt?" Naigu, unable to move much with his nose being stepped on, tried to shake his head to indicate that he felt no pain. However, The pressure on his nose made it impossible to move his neck as he intended. Instead, he used his upturned gaze to focus on the disciple's feet, noticing cracks in the monk's dry skin. Annoyed by the situation and the repeated questioning, Naigu finally spoke in an irritated voice. "It doesn't hurt." The exchange, though brief, was laden with a mix of absurdity and tension, highlighting Naigu's discomfort, not from physical pain, but from the indignity of the moment. In truth, the sensation of having the itchy parts of his nose stepped on was less painful than it was oddly satisfying. It was almost pleasant. After some time, small bumps resembling millet grains began to form on Naigu's nose. The appearance of his nose now resembled that of a small bird, plucked of its feathers and roasted whole. When the disciple monk noticed this, he stopped stepping on the nose and muttered to himself, "This is when we're supposed to pluck them out with tweezers." Naigu puffed out his cheeks in mild displeasure but said nothing, choosing instead to silently endure the disciple's actions. He allowed the monk to proceed, despite his visible dissatisfaction. It wasn't that he failed to recognize the disciple's well-meaning intentions, but the entire ordeal left him feeling increasingly irked. Even though Zenki Naigu understood the disciple's intentions, he couldn't shake the discomfort of having his nose treated as though it were merely an object. It left him feeling deeply unsettled. Like a patient undergoing surgery from a doctor they didn't entirely trust, Naigu wore a sullen expression as he reluctantly watched the disciple pluck the fat from the pores of his nose using tweezers. The fat, resembling the shafts of bird feathers, was about 4 bun, roughly 1.2 centimeters, in length as it was extracted. Naigu observed the process in silence, his discomfort and irritation growing with every pull. When the first round of the procedure was complete, the disciple monk wiped his brow and let out a small sigh of relief, as though finishing an arduous task. Then, with a tone of renewed determination, he remarked, "Now we need to boil it once more to complete the process." Zenki Naigu maintained his displeased expression, his brows furrowed in a figure-8 shape, but he grudgingly allowed the disciple monk to proceed with the second round of boiling. When the nose was finally removed from the boiling water after the second treatment, the results were astonishing. The once long, dangling nose had shrunk significantly, now appearing hardly different from a typical hooked nose. Naigu gingerly stroked his shortened nose, and with visible hesitation, nervously peeked into the mirror that the disciple handed him. The nose, once stretching down to his chin, had shrunken so dramatically that it barely extended over his upper lip, looking pitifully deflated. Its surface bore patches of redness, likely marks left from the stomping it had endured. Yet, in this diminished state, Naigu felt confident that no one would laugh at him anymore. The reflection in the mirror revealed Naigu's face looking back at him, eyes blinking with satisfaction. For the first time, the mirrored Naigu and the real Naigu shared a mutual sense of contentment. That day, however, Zenki Naigu remained uneasy, plagued by the fear that his nose might somehow return to its former length. Even while reciting sutras or eating meals, he couldn't resist the urge to reach out and gently touch the tip of his nose whenever he had a spare moment. Yet every time he checked, the nose behaved itself, sitting obediently above his upper lip, showing no sign of sagging back to its previous state. The night passed uneventfully, and the following morning, as soon as Naigu woke, his first action was to touch his nose again. To his great relief, it was still short. For the first time in years, Naigu felt a sense of lightness and freedom, a feeling akin to the satisfaction he experienced after accumulating merits through the painstaking task of transcribing the Lotus Sutra. The burden that had long weighed on his spirit seemed to have finally lifted. However, within 2 or 3 days, Zenki Naigu made an unexpected discovery. A samurai who had come to the Ike-no-O temple on some errand stared at Naigu's nose with a barely concealed smirk, his amusement so evident that he could hardly hold a proper conversation. The samurai's gaze fixated on Naigu's nose, now more intently than ever, as though it were even funnier than before. This behavior wasn't limited to the samurai. The junior monk who had once dropped Naigu's nose into a bowl of porridge crossed paths with him near the lecture hall. At first, the boy tried to suppress his laughter by looking down, but soon he couldn't contain himself and burst out laughing, unable to hold it in any longer. Even the temple's lower-ranking monks, who usually showed deference, struggled to maintain composure. They would listen attentively when speaking to Naigu face to face, but the moment he turned his back, they would stifle giggles or chuckle softly. This happened not just once or twice, but repeatedly, making it clear that something about Naigu's nose had now become an even greater source of amusement. At first, Zenki Naigu tried to explain the change as a reaction to the alteration in his appearance. He reasoned that his shorter nose was simply unexpected and unfamiliar, which naturally invited more amusement. Certainly, this seemed to account for why the junior monks and novices laughed. They were reacting to the novelty. However, this explanation felt incomplete. The way people laughed now was distinctly different from before, when his nose was long. Back then, their laughter carried a certain restraint, as if they were careful not to offend him too directly. Now, the humor seemed sharper, more direct, and unrestrained. It wasn't just the novelty of the short nose that made it funny. There was something deeper at play, though Naigu couldn't quite grasp what it was. Before, they didn't laugh so openly or brazenly. Naigu would sometimes mutter to himself, interrupting his recitation of sutras. Tilting his bald head in contemplation, he would gaze absently at the image of Fugen Bodhisattva hanging nearby. These moments of reflection often brought back memories of just a few days earlier, when his nose was still long. He couldn't help but recall those days with a sense of melancholy, as if lamenting the downfall of a once proud figure reflecting on their fleeting glory. Unfortunately for Naigu, he lacked the clarity to answer the troubling question that lingered in his mind. Why had his newly shortened nose, intended to resolve his suffering, instead become a fresh source of ridicule? Human nature harbors two conflicting emotions. On the one hand, everyone feels sympathy for the misfortunes of others. Yet, when the afflicted person somehow overcomes their suffering, there arises an inexplicable sense of dissatisfaction in the observer. To exaggerate slightly, it's almost as if one might wish to see the person fall back into the same misfortune just to restore a familiar balance. This subtle shift can even lead to a quiet but undeniable hostility toward the individual who has escaped their plight. Zenki Naigu, while unable to articulate the precise reason, felt an unmistakable unease in the changed attitudes of the monks and laypeople around him. What he intuitively sensed was this self-centered detachment of the onlookers, a sort of passive schadenfreude rooted in their discomfort with his newfound freedom from his former burden. The people of Ike-no-o, who had grown used to Naigu's long nose as a symbol of his struggle, now found themselves subtly resenting the resolution of his predicament. Their laughter and ridicule, sharper and less restrained than before, were the natural expression of this paradoxical selfishness. It was this hidden hostility that Naigu had begun to perceive, even if he couldn't fully comprehend or articulate its cause. Zenki Naigu's mood grew steadily worse by the day. He became irritable, quick to scold anyone who crossed his path. Even the disciple monk who had diligently helped with the nose treatment began muttering behind Naigu's back, saying, "The master will bring upon himself the sin of Hokkenden greed for the Dharma." What angered Naigu most, however, was the mischievous junior monk, the same boy who had once dropped his nose into a bowl of porridge. One day, Naigu heard a loud commotion, dogs barking furiously outside. Curious, he stepped out to investigate and found the boy chasing a long-haired, emaciated mutt around the grounds, brandishing a 2-foot-long piece of wood. The boy wasn't merely chasing the dog, he was gleefully shouting, "Watch out, or your nose will get hit. Watch out, or your nose will get hit." He repeated this over and over, mocking the situation with unabashed delight. Overcome with rage, Naigu snatched the wooden stick from the boy's hands and struck him soundly across the face. As it happened, the stick was none other than the very piece of wood that had once been used to prop up Naigu's nose during meals. The irony of the object's repurposing added an extra sting to the moment, both for Naigu and, quite literally, for the mischievous boy. Zenki Naigu found himself increasingly resentful of his shortened nose. What had once seemed like a solution to his troubles now felt like a curse, leaving him plagued with regret. One evening, after sunset, a sudden wind began to blow, and the chimes on the temple pagoda jingled incessantly, their sound piercing the stillness and reaching Naigu's pillow with annoying persistence. To make matters worse, the temperature had dropped significantly, and the chill seeped into his aging body, making sleep impossible. Restless in his bed, Naigu lay awake, staring into the darkness. As he shifted uncomfortably, he noticed an unusual itchiness in his nose. When he touched it, he found it slightly swollen and damp, as if retaining moisture. It even felt warm to the touch, an alarming sign. Could it be that forcing it to shrink has caused some illness? He wondered aloud, his voice tinged with unease. With the care and reverence of one offering flowers at a Buddhist altar, Naigu gently cradled his nose in his hands, murmuring this thought as if in prayer. The notion that his meddling might have brought about this discomfort weighed heavily on his already troubled mind. The next morning, Zenki Naigu awoke early, as was his custom. When he looked outside, he found the temple garden transformed overnight. The ginkgo and horse-chestnut trees had shed all their leaves, carpeting the ground in a radiant blanket of gold. The scene was unusually bright, as though the earth itself had been gilded. On the roof of the pagoda, frost had settled, and in the pale morning sunlight, the current finial shimmered with dazzling brilliance. Standing on the veranda, Naigu slid open the shittami shutters and took a deep, deliberate breath of the crisp air. The chill filled his lungs, awakening his senses. At that moment, a long-forgotten sensation stirred within him. something he had not felt in what seemed like an eternity. The feeling was faint yet undeniable, as though some part of his old self had quietly returned to him, reawakening in the stillness of the golden morning. Zenki Naigu hastily reached for his nose. What his hand touched was not the short nose from the night before. Instead, it was the familiar length of old, 5 or 6 sun dangling from above his upper lip to below his chin. His nose had reverted to its original state overnight. As this realization dawned on him, Naigu felt a strange yet undeniable sense of relief, the same kind of lightheartedness he had experienced when his nose had first been shortened. A sense of inner clarity and ease seemed to well up from deep within him. "Well, now, no one will laugh at me anymore," he whispered to himself, reassuringly. With his long nose swaying gently in the crisp autumn morning breeze, Naigu felt oddly at peace, as though his burdens had finally found their proper place.
Until we meet again, may the stories of Japan inspire your days. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales.